Hi, it's Eric Martin. We're here today to explore this wonderful phenomenon in organizations where people come into a room, they agree to do something that's going to change things, improve things, and they all nod their heads in earnest and then leave the room and not a whole lot changes. I call this the head nodding phenomenon, and I'm sure you've seen it as I have all over the place. The question here is, when we're trying to lead change, adaptive change, whose work is it really? Oftentimes, the hope is that the person who initiated the change, the person who is most excited by it, is the person who will actually do the work. But as we know, people tend not to own what they don't create. People tend not to buy into initiatives unless they've been deeply involved in both conceiving them but also implementing them. So this question of whose work is it is critical to moving from planning to action. There's a silly metaphor I like to use around this example, and it's what I call the vegetable stew metaphor. So imagine, if you will, that a bunch of vegetables come together, maybe into a room, maybe a room like the one that you've been in recently, and these vegetables want to create a vegetable stew. So they all contribute their ideas. The carrot contributes from carrot land, and the onion contributes his perspective from onion land, and they make this wonderful stew. They make this wonderful concoction of all the different flavors. And then the carrot goes back to his or her people, back to carrot land, and tries to sell the other carrots on the idea of this vegetable stew, how it's going to be the best thing that they've ever tasted. It's going to change how they think about vegetable stews from here on. What typically happens is that the other carrots, sniff around, and they say to that carrot, you smell a little bit like an onion. We sent you into that meeting, that conversation, to spread carrot juice on those other vegetables, and you came back smelling like them. And if you do too much of that as a carrot, they'll cut off your top and disband you, exile you from carrot land. So it's a silly metaphor, but it's an example of what I think it takes to do real collaboration. The idea that when we come together as a group to decide on something, the hard work, the leadership work, the adaptive work often is about what happens outside the room. So while it's really important to bring people into a room and create safe space, to foster best practice sharing, to build relationship, develop insight, this is all really important stuff. The question becomes, how do you help people cross the boundaries of that safe space back into the real world? The agencies, the communities, the funders that they came from. So what we want to think about when you pull people into a room is not just the case for change or the value proposition. That has to be solid, don't get me wrong. You have to be very clear what the value proposition is for change and have data, maybe a slick PowerPoint presentation to back it up. The challenge becomes that people often approach change as if it's just a sales job. If we just had the right data, if we just had the right logic, the right argument, that the rest of the change process would happen. And I'm sure you've seen, as have I, that often isn't the case. In fact, when you present data or change to people that contradicts their assumptions, their beliefs, their values, it often makes them more resistant to change than to begin with. So we want to begin with an assumption that making the case alone isn't sufficient. That what's required is to create a mobilization strategy with each other that takes into account the values, the loyalties, and the losses at risk for each of the folks around the table and the people that they're working on behalf of. So let's think a little bit about what do we mean by values, loyalties, and losses. Well, one way to think about what a value is and how to figure out what people value is to look at their behavior. Now, people espouse many values. People espouse very noble values. Personally, I'm very committed to climate change. But I've done nothing on behalf of climate change in the last 3 months. So that kind of tells you what I value, which is more around things of routine and familiarity and consistency. So I want you to watch how people behave. How do they spend their time and resources? What kind of programs and services do they fund or become involved in or get excited about? These tend to be the things that they value. And the point here with adaptive work is that that value that they hold for the espoused change may be number 17 on the list. And most of the time, if it's not in the top 3 to 5, it's not going to get acted on. So we need to understand what are the other competing priorities or competing values that people would have to subsume in order to make the value of change higher on the agenda. It's tough work, it's adaptive work, but it's also what leads to more sustainable change down the road. A second thing to think about, other than values, are loyalties. Now, oftentimes when we explain a change to somebody and they resist us, we think that they don't get it. And so we explain it louder. The problem often isn't that they don't get it. It's that they get it perfectly and they just don't like it. They don't like it because it affects people that are important to them. People on their team, people in their organizations, people in their communities. So loyalties is the idea that when leading change, we need to think about the people that are impacted through the lens of the people around the table and find ways to support them, materially and otherwise, in refashioning those loyalties, refashioning those relationships with people in their community so that they can actually have a chance of instituting and implementing that change. Now, it's often an overlooked part of the change process. We think that if we can agree to something in the room, that one representative, that person that's coming from the community, can do all the work that's needed to shift values and shift relationships in the community, in their communities. It's really hard work, particularly if you've been in an organization for a long time or have deep standing relationships with community members. So how do we strategize around that piece of the work and not just focus on the case for change? The third idea, the third force that pulls people away from adaptive work are losses. Now, losses take many forms. Loss of autonomy, loss of relationship, loss of resource, power. Sometimes the biggest impediment to change is just a sense of convenience. People don't want to give up the convenient life that they've developed, the routines, the processes that they've developed in organizations. So even a loss of a sense of routine can prevent change. Another kind of loss is a loss of a sense of competence. We all want to feel competent in how we do our work, but oftentimes it's required to develop new skill sets, new capacities to deal with changes in our communities. So the loss of a sense of competence can itself be an impediment to change. So values, loyalties, and losses are an often underlooked but highly leverageable source of strategy making in change initiatives. So this idea of thinking of the work of leadership as mobilizing others to engage in work for which there's no easy answer. That's leadership work. It's a really critical and capacity building source in organizations. So rather than seeing these engagement processes that you may be a part of as an opportunity to vie for power, to hammer home a point of view, can we find a way to include those voices in our communities, in our organizations, and really understand what the adaptive work is for them and organize around that? I look forward to continuing the conversation with you. Thank you for your time.